It's March 20th, 2024, 21 years after your government attacked Iraq based on lies. Let's discuss the truth about war. Our world is lost in unnecessary fear and hurt. Our systems seem scientifically engineered to make you small, powerless, and always waiting for the next great leader who will fix the problems around us. Worse, we're witnessing neighbor versus neighbor while warfare breaks out around our family tables. But you have access to a spirit, a strength that enlarges and empowers you. Even better, you don't need to wait for the next big movement. You can heal the world. It's time for governance by grace. Welcome to Gracearchy with Jim Babka. On March 20th, 2003, a day I remember well, the Bush-Cheney administration launched an unprovoked war based on a false flag, a lie about nuclear weapons targeted at Americans by a Middle Eastern despot who might be so desperate he'd use terrorists to help him do it. No major American institution did a thing to dispel these lies. Let me say that even stronger and still accurately, every major American institution was either silent or promoted the lies being told by the Bush-Cheney team, who were busy cooking up and distorting the intelligence to get Americans, tenderized by 9/11, to crave the easiest and simplest war ever. Jim Babka led a team that included past guest Perry Willis, who wrote the War Truth series, to produce a series of radio ads and a website that we're going to review today. It's called truthaboutwar.org. You can also find it truthaboutwar.com. So let's get into it. Hey, Jim, this is heavy. Why are we now looking at this thing that's, 21 years old?
Well, my number one motivation for wanting to discuss this is we did a conspiracy series in December. And to me, like we talked about how to understand and view conspiracy and where conspiracy lies. So I encourage people to go review those 3 episodes.
Yeah, please do.
Now we want to start to address that. And we want to illustrate that conspiracies actually do happen, which ones we believe are real, and why we believe they're real. And this is the very first time I want to do this. The first casualty of war is truth.
Yeah.
Our politicians frequently lie us into war. And in the case of the Iraq War of 2003, in that particular case, there was a false flag operation run, and you were the enemy. The government had already decided, the people who controlled the state at the time, the Bush-Cheney administration, had already made a premeditated decision that they were going to go to war to depose Saddam Hussein. They were looking for a provoking event to do it. And they set about to do this. This was a conspiracy that was run against you. There was nothing in your media, nothing in the groups that you were following, for the most part, where you were being told this. We alone, and there's very, very few people. I'll get into who else I think was there in a minute, but we felt very alone in going out and talking about what was happening. The information was there, and so that's why I want to review this particular case, because I was there at the time, and we were able to show that there was a conspiracy afoot. And the interesting thing is that now almost everyone recognizes it, right? Hardly anyone disputes some of the things we'll say today. They have become cliche and banal because they are so obvious. But back then, I can tell you that wasn't the situation.
Hey, I was a Kool-Aid drinker, brother. I saw the whole thing. I watched Colin Powell spiel at the United Nations, and I was on board. Military family, all of that. We're like, yeah, go flag. But I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind. And this illustrates a point that we make here often on Gracearchy, right? Which is you have to be willing to be wrong, right, in order to learn something new.
Yeah, and you need to stay open to that. So I view what we did at truthaboutwar.org as a perfect case of heuristic thinking. Now, this is what I mean by that. Heuristics are best guesses based on past experiences, right?
Yeah.
I have some understanding. I have a set of intellectual tools that I can look at something and assess what's happening. And here's the reason you need such a thing. You need such a thing because you don't have all of the information yet, and yet you are being compelled, often by fear, to make a decision now.
Yep. It was the fear
So
thing all the way.
you can call this principles because some aspect of it is principle. You can call it faith because some aspect of it is a belief in the things that you know, right? You can call it history, study of history, right? You know
Sure.
what's happened in the past. You could see where it comes together.
History repeats
You
itself,
can
right?
Our heuristics were, and I'm going to give you a very fundamental one. This will come as a big surprise to everybody. In fact, I hope everybody is sitting down. If you're driving, maybe you should pull over right now because I'm going to say something that's so shocking, so surprising that you're going to be like, I just, it never occurred to me before. You ready?
Yeah, hit me. And by the way, people, we're disclaiming this right now. If you are driving and crash into something when Jim speaks next, not our fault.
All right, here we go. Brace yourselves. Politicians tend to lie.
Oh my gosh. Are you serious?
Yes.
Why have I
And,
never heard this before? Didn't they
right.
teach me this in school?
And the place that they lie the most is at war. And they don't, and in fact, they are so concerned with promoting and perpetuating lies that when truth comes out during a war, and by the way, it can also happen during crises like the one we just had with the you know what, the sea thing that everybody had.
Yep.
In those situations, they are heavily into suppressing any release of the truth. They are very interested in making sure that propaganda is put out. So in war, truth is the first casualty. We knew that. And so we set about to go looking for the evidence. And it turned out that if you turned off the television for a few minutes, if you stopped reading the Washington Post for a few moments, if you started instead, because the drive-by media was excited, they're going to get a war. And this can make a correspondent's career, right?
Oh, sure.
You
And
could
it
become the
did.
next
Remember,
stud, right?
yeah, Wolf Blitzer. He
Yeah,
was the first
all of
one.
these guys. Yeah, all these guys make a lot of them made their careers with the first Gulf War, so they're all excited about Gulf War II, the reunion, right?
Yeah.
CNN put itself kind of permanently in every one of our psyche with that first war. So we we recognize the truth of that, and that caused us, that heuristic thinking caused us to go look for facts that were contrary to what we were being told. And it turned out if you did the looking, you would find them. And then we were able to share that stuff out. So we put this website up. Let me be clear about this. We put this website up at the beginning of February. It was up roughly the same time, like almost synonymous as Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations.
How
So
was
we
it
were already.
received, Jim? I wish I'd known, right? I didn't see it.
Okay.
Okay.
First off, my favorite story is a personal one. We received a death threat. We got a written death threat, and we published that we had gotten this written death threat because we didn't know who had sent it to us. They'd mailed it to us with no return address on it. We published the fact that we had it, and we pointed out that we weren't pacifists, we weren't pinkos. They were welcome to come visit. We believed in self-defense, and we were prepared. I will just say that.
Nobody showed up.
But here's the other story I really like to tell. We ran a series of radio ads. We're going to share the radio ads with you here today. We're going to play the 4 radio ads that we ran at the time. And we had a great radio station owner in West Virginia who ran the ads for the entire 6-7 week run that we had going. But we were a very limited means at the time, and we had to raise our money on a week by week basis. So we would raise the money, then go to a station, raise the money, then go to a station. And that's how we did it. So we got into one city per week outside of West Virginia. We got kicked out of every single city we were in except for those West Virginia stations. The person that was in West Virginia, his name was Jack. Jack was completely with us. He was a donor, later served on our board. Jack was completely down with us and told us how to go about buying and placing the ads, helped us with the doing of that. And we went to every city. And this included San Francisco. We were on in San Francisco opposing this war. And when we ran these ads, we got kicked out of San Francisco. We got kicked out of every single city we were in. We would come back and say, we want to do another week's run. And they would say, nope, we can't do a week with you. They were getting negative feedback from their listeners. Everything that we said in these ads, which will seem banal, it'll seem trite, like, oh, gee, everybody knows that, was not at the time. It was violently opposed. It was completely wrong. The country had been tenderized, as I like to put it, by 9/11. I want to tell
For sure.
a quick story, real quick short story. We had a few people that inspired us to make the site. So Harry Brown had written his biggest column ever, called "When Will We Learn?" that he released on 9/12. He questioned what had been done previously, and he got so much pushback because how dare you say any of this stuff when people just died yesterday? Um,
Yeah.
but he had been saying it was coming for years, and here it was, and it was because of our U.S. foreign policy that it happened. And so he expressed that he was continuously writing from September of 2001 until late 2002. He was writing about these issues again and again and again. He was doing multi-series articles on the websites that were publishing at the time, namely WorldNet Daily mostly, but other sites as well. And that "When Will We Learn" column was the most widely published piece he ever wrote, and as in terms of a column. He had best-selling books, but that was the biggest column. And we had also come across the work of supply side economist Jude Winniski, who's now also left us. Both Harry and Jude are no longer with us. And he was opposing this. There were others as well, but Jude's work had inspired me in particular. I was liking how he was approaching this. If you were to take the supply siders and you were to take neocons and you were to create a Venn diagram out of these people, there was a heavy overlap. So he was on the outside of that Venn diagram saying, he's one of these people who believe not just in cutting taxes, but also cutting spending, right? The whole plan required, the way you grew the economy was you cut the taxes first and then you cut the spending. And the cut the spending part never came with the supply side. Jude did that. And the last guy was Bill Olson, who is still alive. And I will be encouraging him to watch this episode so he can hear his name. He was our attorney at the time. And he was saying, you really ought to do something about this. And so we did. And so that was how we got started doing this. And we had a great team of people helping us to do this. This is the website that I'm proudest of in all the time that I've been working. And it's 2003. It's the beginning of 2003. And it's frozen in time for people to go back and look for themselves. And Jeff Braun helped us come up with the design, including the thing that we say at the very top, which I'm not going to say out loud. Go look at the site. I stand by what we said and did there. So go check out truthaboutwar.com.
Got it.
All right. You wanted me
Now,
to set the stage, right?
Yeah. Take us up to Colin Powell.
So Colin Powell goes and he gives a speech at the UN. It was nationally televised. It was carried on the news networks. It was carried on the regular networks. It's what everybody was watching. There are a few times in history where everybody's got their TVs turned on. The most previous recent time that everybody had done that was OJ's verdict. And this was the next time that happened. Everybody is tuned in to hear Colin Powell's presentation. The whole country was caught up in what this debate was going to be. And he laid out a case that included photographic imagery showing that they had weapons of mass destruction. They had a weapons of mass destruction program that was well underway. He used satellite imagery. He used photographs. He used data that they had from intelligence reports. He revealed intelligence that had not previously been revealed about connections. This included an incredibly tenuous connection between Saddam Hussein and terrorism. We may get into that during the course of this episode. But he laid that all out, and it seemed very compelling. Now, I want to say, again, all this seems ubiquitous. Everybody gets it. All right, they lied. Well, even Colin Powell, before he died, admitted that he was misled, that he did something against his conscience at the time, and that he regretted this moment. That was probably the most famous moment of his life, but he lived to regret it. And the second thing I would like to point out to set the stage for context was that they wanted to convince you that the Saddam Hussein did have nuclear weapons and that he intended to use them against the United States. And in October of 2022, George W. Bush stood up and gave a speech where he suggested that a rather small amount of highly enriched uranium could be used to make a bomb that would show up. In fact, I want to share with you the exact quote. This went viral in the terms of that time. If the Iraq regime is able to produce buy or steal an amount of highly enriched uranium a little larger than a single softball. You could have a nuclear weapon in less than a year. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. Here, Bill, the picture was clear. We were facing an existential crisis. We could have an American city blown up by this Muslim despot.
So the first ad that ran back in the day in 2003 was an ad called Doubts. And we're going to play it for you next. It uncovers some of the factual issues that were wrong with the lead up to the Gulf War.
I believe in the Constitution and the rule of law. So after the terrorist attacks, I was glad we had someone like George Bush in the White House. And when I heard he was going to go after Saddam Hussein, I thought, it's about time. But I'm beginning to have my doubts. I recently discovered a new website called truthaboutwar.com where I learned some surprising things. I learned Saddam Hussein has no nuclear weapons right now. Iraq's weapons program was dismantled after the first Gulf War. I learned Saddam Hussein has no clear ties to Osama bin Laden or al-Qaeda. In fact, Hussein and bin Laden have been enemies for years. And at truthaboutwar.com, I was reminded that the Constitution requires the president to get approval, a declaration of war, before he launches an attack. But President Bush has never sought any such declaration. Learn the truth. Visit truthaboutwar.com.
Okay, Jim, let's talk about this ad because there were no weapons of mass destruction, right?
Yeah, let's start with that. I want to make a major point. Saddam Hussein had no nuclear weapons. So Iraq's weapons program was dismantled by the first Gulf War. There had been a war in 1991 with George H.W. Bush as president. And during that war, they had begun to, they really weakened tremendously Saddam Hussein and gained access to all of his weapons programs. It was part of the peace treaty or deal. He stayed in power, but they continued to have access to his programs, and they dismantled it completely, just completely.
Yeah, whatever it was.
And they went in and they dismantled all weapons of mass destruction. Now, there's an interesting little thing that happened right before they decided they were going to go into Iraq. They changed the definition of what a weapon of mass destruction was.
I remember this. All of a sudden, they included chemical and biological weapons.
Yeah, so this is similar to what happened before the the C thing that everybody had. They changed the definition of people who did not want to take the shot. You were an anti-V, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they changed the definition of that right before that happened too. They redefined that word. Well, in this case, they redefined weapons of mass destruction and not just merely be nuclear. They opened it up to include biological and chemical that could be put on some kind of delivery system.
Sure.
Okay.
Suitcase bombs,
Right.
We didn't have drones, but, dropped from an airplane, that kind of thing.
So we went, this was the claim that I was the most scared to make, it was our biggest claim. And nobody could believe us at the time because the intelligence reports, Colin Powell's presentation, the things that the president was saying, all of this led up to a belief, the way the media was portraying this, that there was just it was gospel truth that Saddam had these programs. And when it came to the chemical weapons, they could say, well, he'd already used them in a war. That's how we knew he had them. Well, the truth of the matter is the reason that we knew that he had them wasn't necessarily the use of them in his war. It was more so the fact that our government had given him those weapons. So the chemical weapons, they had come from the United States. Okay. There's a whole history about this involving Donald Rumsfeld and so forth. He was around back he was in the Nixon and Ford era. He was around again in the Reagan era. And he is around again in the second Bush administration. He takes the first Bush administration off, but he's around. He pops up at various times.
So this was back when they were setting up Saddam Hussein in the first place.
Yeah. Our government was on his side in a war started in 1979. Jimmy Carter had encouraged it. It ran through most of the 80s between Iraq and Iran. And Iraq did use chemical weapons in that war.
The ones
There's
that
no
we
way-
made and sent them.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting because I want to talk about two ways that we knew that all of this was completely baloney. Okay. First thing I want to say is the president, in the statement that I read earlier, suggested that a softball size amount of highly enriched uranium was all it was going to take. This may sound to you like it's a small amount of highly enriched uranium. It's way more than you can carry. Okay. It's heavy and it takes a lot to get it made. So, highly enriched uranium is a process. We won't go through the science of it today, but to get to a softball size amount is not insignificant. Now, I just recently had the opportunity during a trip to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to visit the nuclear I don't know if it's an energy museum. I can't think of the name of it now, but it's basically about the bomb. And it does have some nuclear energy stuff in it, but it's a lot. The first half of the museum is about the bomb. There are planes on the outside of it. And they want to tell specifically the story of the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they go into other nuclear weaponry as well throughout the Cold War. And the size of the sites that you need in order to carry this out are massive. The facilities that you need are massive. The tools that you need to carry this out, some of them are so highly specific that we can track the materials as they're traveling around the globe. They're not the kind of thing that you could sneak around. And our weapons inspectors had been everywhere that they had asked. Scott Ritter went on CNN International, not CNN Domestic, I want to point out, CNN International, and spoke to Fionnuala Sweeney, who is somebody that nobody knows the name here because she was on CNN International. And he explained to her that they had gone to every facility they'd wanted to. Now, it might have taken some delays of a day or a week or a month or two to get into some of those things, but they had gotten into everything that they had sought to get into, and they had shut it down, and there was no way that they could have snuck or built up the process to get to the nukes. Furthermore, chemical weapons had a shelf life. Most chemical weapons have a shelf life of about 5 years, and most biologics have a shelf life of under 3. And all of these facts add up to the idea, because what the George W. Bush administration wanted you to believe is that they could have these mobile nuclear labs. They were building the weapons on the back of trucks. It is the height of absurdity that they could have pulled that off. And they're able to take advantage of people's scientific ignorance. There's no reason that you need to know that to get through your day. And they were able to take full advantage of that and did. I want to make a second major point, Bill. Second major point. Saddam Hussein had no ties to al-Qaeda.
Now, how in the world? I mean, is it, and you said the word ignorance, so I'll use it. Is it just because we weren't aware of these things, Jim?
Well, we couldn't have been. We couldn't have been. And honestly, most of the people, so, hostages are taken in Iran, right? Very shortly thereafter, there's a popular song on the radio, Bomb, 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 Iran, to the tune of Barbara Ann by the Beach Boys, right? And everybody's on board because they think this comes completely out of the blue. But in Iran, they actually get history, or they found out what was going on, unlike Americans, whose media spends its time lying for war. Remember, I said politicians lie, especially when there's a war. So they tell you lies about what happened there. In the case of 9/11, they said it was, they hate us for our freedom, which is the, baloney. And then they tell you the same in Iran. They told you it was because they hate Americans. They have just a hatred of Americans. Well, no, that wasn't it at all. A coup in the early 1950s had been run out of that very same embassy by our CIA to overthrow the democratic government of Iran. And the Shah who took over ends up being a guy who arrests people in the middle of the night, disappears some of them, tortures others, and suppressed the religious expression, and because he was trying to secularize the society. So they turned to a religious leader named the Ayatollah, and he was in exile. And long story short, he comes back to power. And this is part of the reemergence of of that power, a much more radical approach than they would have otherwise chosen if they'd been allowed to democratically evolve without our intervention.
A
So
theocracy, essentially, right?
yeah, yeah. So the idea that, here we were at 9/11, people were told that Osama bin Laden hated us for our freedom, and that, he didn't like American values. We were too decadent in his view, and that's why he was attacking us, which was complete nonsense because he had issued what were called fatwas, where he had expressed out loud what his specific objections were, and the majority of them had to do with our foreign policy behaviors. He objected to our interventions in various places in the world. There's a fascinating story. We were being told at the time in 1991 or 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait that they were massing troops on the border of Saudi Arabia. So again, because they lie and they want to get propaganda out, they shut down commercial access to any images coming from satellites of that region of the world. But Russian satellites didn't cooperate. And the commercial access had been granted because by that point the Soviet Union was in decline and they needed the money. And so you could purchase the images, and the images show that there were no troops massed at the border, no tanks, no nothing. It wasn't happening. They weren't planning on going from Kuwait to Saudi Arabia. That was all part of a lie. They had figured out that was necessary to tell us to go in there. Okay. So they routinely lie about these things. So here's the lie they told after 9/11, George Bush is standing up in October of 2022 with the mushroom cloud. That's 13 months after the towers had gone down.
Yeah.
And they're saying that they've got this terrorist, which Colin Powell reveals this information, and his name was al-Zarqawi. And Zarqawi was a Jordanian-born Palestinian who was in Afghanistan and Kurdistan. He was part of the al-Qaeda network. And do you want to know what the evidence was that he was involved?
Stringy at best.
He went to Baghdad at some point.
Yeah, there we go. That's enough.
Okay. Let me do the logic here so that you can follow along closely. All of the terrorists that were on the planes on 9/11 that took them down were in American cities like, I don't know, Los Angeles.
Sure.
So by that logic, was George W. Bush involved in bringing down the Twin Towers?
Yeah, I'm with you on the logic. It doesn't hold up.
It doesn't hold up. It's completely flimsy. Okay.
And that's the only claim. That's the only evidence they claim they have.
Well, they had a second piece of evidence involving the murder of Lawrence Foley in Jordan. But again, this doesn't explain anything about Saddam Hussein. That's who the attack's against.
Right.
Okay. Saddam Hussein was not involved. So he was actually an enemy. And he
of al-Qaeda.
Yes, and he had tremendous fear that his government was a secular government that had a Jewish and Christian population inside it. The majority of the country was Shia. The reason he went to war with Iran was because he didn't want the Shia to take over as the dominant majority. He happened to be a Sunni Muslim, but he was opposed to radical Sunni Islam because he thought that he wanted a more secular state. He was not in the same camp. This would be like a progressive Christian wanting to sign up to be in Jerry Falwell's crusade, right? It's just, these are opposites. They don't attract. They don't like each other. They resent each other. And these guys were not friends. So they were not together. And there's one other thing that the ad brings out. Just let me touch on this before we go on to the next one. And that is that the Constitution has a specific requirement that a declaration of war should occur.
Right. This has always bothered me, Jim. Why didn't we declare war?
We haven't declared war since we did so against the Japanese the Germans a few days after Pearl Harbor. We immediately declared war against Japan when they attacked us, and a few days later ended up declaring war against Germany. The United States has not declared war since. And this is the act of cowardice so they passed a resolution in the Congress, which is a sense of the body. It has no teeth, no meaning, no nothing. And all this tepid resolution said was we're giving the president the ability to use the War Powers Act in his discretion to secure or protect the American people from a potential attack by basically the securing of nuclear weapons by Saddam Hussein that could be used against the American people. That was all it said. It was all it said. And what this does is it gives every politician the ability to be for the war before they're against it. This is, let me say that again. They could be for the war before they're against it. If it's going well, they were there. They voted for the resolution.
We voted.
If they don't like it, well, I didn't approve this war. We gave this to the president to handle. And they actually believed that this gave them plausible deniability. Their nominee, John Kerry, was for the war before he was running against George W. Bush in the general election, at which point he started to reconsider whether he really was for it. And he couldn't decide for sure yet because the war wasn't completely unpopular yet. And everybody still didn't know quite yet that the weapons of mass destruction thing had been a lie. There was still some reason to maybe suspect that they're going to find the weapons eventually, but even though they hadn't been able to find them. So he didn't know for sure that he was against it, but he was hinting he might be against it.
Well,
right?
Swift boating him took care of the clarity in that case.
Well, yeah, that's another story for another day.
Exactly.
So I just want to say a constitutional authorization for war would say, we have a war. These are the reasons we're having this war, and it won't be settled until the following things are true. And it means that the president, who has the responsibility to be commander in chief and carry out the war, is not the king. He doesn't get to decide when the war ends. He doesn't decide to set the terms of the war. It means the people's representatives are involved, and they have abdicated this responsibility now for 80 years. All right.
Okay, let's do the next ad.
So, what do you think about this war with Iraq?
Frankly, I don't trust the Bush administration. They're the same people who lied to us about the last Gulf War.
They lied to us?
Oh, yeah. They acted like it was this big surprise when Iraq invaded Kuwait, remember? The fact is, our government knew Saddam's plans well in advance, and they did nothing to stop him.
Where'd you hear that?
It's all documented on this website, truthaboutwar.com. And that's not all. Remember when we were told that Iraqi troops were about to invade Saudi Arabia? Another lie. You can read all about it at truthaboutwar.com.
But that was 10 years ago. What makes you think Bush isn't telling the truth now?
Get this. In his new book, White House insider David Frum reveals that Bush had plans to oust Saddam long before 9/11 ever happened.
You mean Bush is just using 9/11 as an excuse? But why?
Want the facts? Check out truthaboutwar.com.
Truthaboutwar.com. I will.
So the first Bush administration knew we were going to attack, that knew Saddam was going to attack Kuwait?
Yes. So this is actually really a super important point. And for us, it was the beginning of knowing that this event that we were looking at was a lie because the first one had been lied about. And it was actually reported initially. This news was available and then it disappeared. And then after the war, it started to come out in a series of articles and books. Now, this is the first Gulf War with George Herbert Walker Bush at the helm, or Bush Sr., as we repeatedly referred to him to keep the distinction clear. Saddam Hussein had three concerns with Kuwait. There was a border dispute that dated back to how Britain had drawn the lines after World War I. Second, Kuwait was allegedly slant drilling into the Iraqi oil fields and stealing the oil that way. So they were working along their border at an angle with their drills, allegedly. It seems odd to us. I have a hard time even now believing it. And three, Kuwait was violating its OPEC production agreements in order to drive down the price of oil and bankrupt Iraq. Now, a little context is necessary here. I had already mentioned that there was a war going on between Iraq and Iran.
Sure.
And Kuwait was one of a handful of countries who had provided aid to Iraq, but the majority of their aid took the form of generous loans. But now the loan prices had come due, and Iraq was basically harmed pretty bad by the war. Didn't go well. It didn't go well for either side. And Iraq was economically pretty badly harmed by the experience. And so now they're in a position where they have to repay these loans, and Kuwait is insisting that they do. And then Kuwait is overproducing oil supply and demand that was driving down the price, and Iraq needed the price to stay high. And then they have these historical antagonisms, including this alleged slant drilling that were kind of piled on top of it. But this third reason was the real driving motivation between them. So Saddam Hussein goes to the State Department. He goes to the Iraqi ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq. Her name was April Glaspie. And he says to her, we're going to settle this one way or another. And she's like, well, we would prefer, this is really not our business. She issues a statement to him that she says comes directly from her boss, who was James Baker, who was the Secretary of State and a very, 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 very close confidant to the president, one of his best friends. She says, quote, "We have no opinion on your Arab-Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary Baker has directed me to emphasize the instruction first given to Iraq in the 1960s that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America." Now, she goes on to add in her response to him, "We hope that you can solve this problem using any suitable methods via Klibi or via President Mubarak. All that we hope is that these are solved quickly." Now, there was supposed to be a meeting between the emir and of Kuwait and Saddam Hussein late that summer of 1990. The emir was a no-show, an unannounced no-show, which was a huge snub. And so the die was cast and Saddam had attacked. So he's thinking that our State Department has given him his blessing. He can go in and do it.
Because we said we don't care what you do, basically.
Exactly. Now that's the State Department. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. Sound familiar? He was Secretary of Defense at the time. Had already told their military side in Iraq, in Kuwait. He already told the military side in Kuwait, we got your back. If Saddam Hussein comes rolling down across your border for any reason, we got your back. So the emir knew he didn't have to show up. The emir knew he didn't have to negotiate. The emir knew he didn't have to get along. He knew that he had us in his corner. And Saddam says, well, I can't attack because I've got the United States blessing. I've got their approval. He was snookered.
Yes.
And the line that Perry wrote that made me smile was something to the effect of, "It's not surprising in a government this size that the right hand doesn't know the left hand was doing, especially when you have a dozen left hands." Right? So was this an innocent mistake? I mean, as he implied in the writing, or was it something more sinister? And it's bothersome that we gave him the green light and essentially empowered him. We had given him weapons. We had been his ally. He was coming to us thinking, I've got a friend, and I'm asking my friend for permission to go take this action. And then our government turns on him.
Big time.
Okay. And in the mix of all of this is we also knew, and I covered it in the previous segment, that they were never going to invade Saudi Arabia. That was another big lie that we were very tuned into, right? Okay, so they tell a similar lie. They invent so at the time in 1990, to get the United States and the world on board, they had to make it seem like he was Hitler on the move, ready to take over the entire Middle East. He was going to start a pan-Arab league, and his next target was going to be Saudi Arabia, which was at the time an ally. And well, this time around, they can't do that anymore. He's been pretty much disempowered. They decided to focus on atrocities. And the atrocity they chose to focus was babies taken out of incubators. So killing babies is common war propaganda. And it came up even in the beginning of the, right after October 7 in the Israeli invasion, right? There's this story that gets told that they're killing the most innocent human beings. So in this case, they took babies out of Kuwaiti hospital incubators and stacked them like cordwood. And we had one of the nurses come and testify before Congress that she had witnessed this happening in real time, and it was horrifying. And she told, through tears, how horrified that she was to the Congress. And we had a United States senator who was one of the decisive votes stand up and say that this was a compelling piece of evidence that provoked him to support the resolution authorizing the president to use military force if he deemed it necessary, except she was in the United States at the time that it happened. She was a relative of embassy staff.
So she didn't see it.
She didn't see it. It never happened.
It never happened.
So I'm saying that, like, heuristically, you should not say it's impossible that an atrocity has been targeted at babies. Babies were bayoneted by the Krauts. Belgian babies were bayoneted in World War I. That was the thing then. You should not automatically dismiss it. That would be rude. You don't have proof it didn't happen. Heuristically speaking, you should approach it in the following way. I'm suspicious. I'm going to wait and see if the evidence comes in. And until the evidence comes in, you'll forgive me for holding off, because I feel like I've seen this before with bayoneted babies and incubators. Let's put up one more major point. George Bush had plans to oust Saddam before 9/11 happened. This is actually a famous story now. Almost everybody knows it, that was alive at the time. In the late 1990s, there was an organization called the Project for a New American Century. And that organization signed a letter. And it had very many famous names, many of which were in the administration. Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld. These guys were all there.
I remember this.
It was in 1998. And they say in the letter that there needs to be regime change. That had been the policy of the Clinton administration. Madeleine Albright had been interviewed by Leslie Stahl, and she was asked about the embargoes that we were running. She said, we're not going to lift these embargoes until Saddam Hussein's gone. We don't care what the country does to cooperate. We're going to continue to embargo food and medical supplies even from the country.
Yeah.
And by that point, Leslie Stahl said there's reason to believe that up to 500,000 people have died as a result of this embargo. Is it worth it? And Madeleine Albright said, we believe it's worth the cost. 500,000 lives, we believe it's worth the cost. This reasoning shows up in Osama bin Laden's fatwa. It's one of the things that he has against us. And one of the reasons he attacked.
Dare I say, rightfully so.
No. I'm not going to endorse anybody's violence on either side. I'm not going to say it's justified. I'm going to say it's understandable.
Yes.
It's not without excuse. Like, you could start to understand why people are motivated to such rage and such awful behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. Right. I don't think the people who died in that building are responsible for what their government did.
Not anywhere close, no. But 500,000 people.
500,000 people. She said that and it just went by. Like, it was on TV, and then everybody went about living their lives and forgot all about it, right?
Was Madeleine Albright correct?
That it was worth the cost?
Yeah.
No, not even close. Okay. So, these things have histories and they come back to get us. But here's my point. The letter said we have to get rid of him. The policy of the federal government during the 1990s was regime change coming into the Bush administration. The people hired to be in the Bush administration were the people who had who had signed that letter. And the letter said, we got a problem. We can't get the American people on board. We got to find a way to get them to understand the nature of this existential threat. It could be that they need a catalyzing event, a Pearl Harbor of sorts, to wake them up. And when 9/11 happened, Donald Rumsfeld is reported to have said, can we just go attack Iraq now? That day, he was already asking, why can't, inside the war room, why can't we just go attack Iraq now?
Yeah.
So this was the plan all along, and they were determined to cook up the intelligence to get to their destination.
Excuse me, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
Why do you think George Bush has decided to attack Iraq?
Because Saddam Hussein is an evil dictator?
Oh, then why don't we attack North Korea? Their leader is an evil dictator.
Yeah, but Saddam's a threat to the United States. He supports terrorists.
Actually, according to the director of the CIA, it seems Saddam hasn't been supporting terrorism against the United States. North Korea, on the other hand, has openly threatened us.
Yeah, but Iraq's building terrible weapons.
Are you sure? Meanwhile, we know North Korea has nuclear weapons. So do China and Pakistan. Why don't we attack them?
If we attack those countries, they'd strike back. Nukes could hit our cities.
Exactly. And the CIA director has warned, if we attack Iraq, Saddam will strike back at us in whatever way he can.
So why are we attacking Iraq?
Good question. Get the facts at truthaboutwar.com.
Truthaboutwar.com. Cool.
I want to hit some highlights here, and I want to start off with another final major point. Hussein supported no terrorism against the United States. It was the director of the CIA we were quoting at the time. That's mentioned in the ad. If you actually go through the history of Saddam Hussein's brutality, his use of chemical weapons, there's some things that jump out at you. First off, this government, the Ba'ath Party government, had been backed and put into place with help from the United States in 1963. They had run a proxy war on our behalf against Iran throughout most of the 1980s. And between 1985 and 1988, our government shipped both chemical and biological weapons to Hussein. And we don't know for sure, but it could have been those chemical weapons that he was using, not just in the later stages of his war with Iran, but against the Kurds, who were another dissident group in the northern part of Iraq who were looking to potentially overthrow or at least push out influence by the Ba'ath Party there. During the course of the war that was going on with Iran, the government, the Ba'ath Party government, became very heavy-handed and totalitarian, as governments tend to do during war. Freedom gets lost during war because war is going on, and they need to do everything they can to keep everything together. They can't have anybody undermining what they're doing. And so that party cracked down, and it imprisoned and executed dissidents. We didn't speak up at all. Our government didn't do a thing during that time because he was our bad guy.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
was our bad guy.
We're watching this from far away. He's not directing it toward us.
Right. And this was a country that was very, very difficult to hold together. It's not a natural piece of land. It was filled with disparate groups who didn't like each other. The level of acidity between Shia and Sunni, particularly in that part of the world, was very, very stark. And Hussein had every reason to want to be the proxy war fighter because he was afraid that the majority population of the country was 60% Shia at the time we attacked. Was going to be able to topple him. He was running from a Sunni minority. And when I say Sunni minority, I mean, it was like a third of the country. They were only about a third of the population, but they were running the country. And he needed to keep all that stuff in place. He had done all these acts and deeds with us, not against us. There's no evidence whatsoever anywhere that they were involved or in bed or in league with al-Qaeda. There's no evidence anywhere that they had weapons of mass destruction, but I want to tell you a funny story about that. There's some people who don't want to be wrong. They're severe hangers-on. And in this class of people, they take and put a lot of weight on one particular story, on one particular event. So Dick Cheney goes on Meet the Press after the administration. He goes on and talks to, after this war's over, he goes on and talks to Tim Russert. And he describes a convoy that had been assembled to get weapons and materials out of the country and into Syria in the dark of night immediately before the attack, and claimed that there was evidence in surveillance of this. The source of that story was, he reported it from, I believe, the New York Times at the time. It appeared in the New York Times. He's like, well, Tim, the New York Times said there's intelligence on this. Well, how did the New York Times get this? One of his aides? There actually was no intelligence. One of his aides had given this information to the New York Times, who then dutifully reported it. And then Cheney, pretending to be completely innocent of it, quotes the New York Times, right? It's a dog that chases its own tail. Yep. And there are people to this day that go, well, they snuck the weapons out right beforehand. I was nervous when we launched this site that, like the police officer, dirty police officer who plants the gun at the scene after he shot somebody, right? Oh, I got shot at. He plants a gun there, and that's supposed to cover the story. I thought they were going to find a way to plant the weapon. It turns out it's really, really hard to move nuclear materials around. It's a huge, big, hairy deal. There was a whole thing about aluminum tubes that was in the news involving the revealing of a spy because her husband had revealed his role in preventing the sale or movement of this particular tool or this particular ingredient in the nuclear weapons program. They couldn't sneak the weapon back in. So they make up a story afterwards, and there are people, I've run into them over the years, who hang on to the story as if it's the gospel. Oh yeah, he had weapons of mass destruction. Right. You saw Colin Powell's presentation. Will you explain to them, like we did here and like we do at truthaboutwar.org, in more detail, what was wrong with that presentation? And then they'll fall back on, well, they snuck them out right beforehand. And the flimsiest of evidence, this is one solitary television interview based on one solitary New York Times piece, based on one invented piece of intelligence coming from one of the vice president's staff. That's it.
That's all we've got.
That's all we've got. That's how big a lie this was. It's a false flag that was run on you, and we bring it up because conspiracies happen. This conspiracy happened right in front of you, and everyone got in on the game.
At this point, we're nowhere near the war on terror, are we?
No, we are in the war on terror. It started with 9/11.
Okay, so we are in the war on terror.
Right, and they were...
They're trying to loop this in.
They're
like it's
trying
part-
to give you the impression that these things are connected together because they knew the people were mad about it. They're using the Project for a New American Century formula. It says there's a catalyzing event of 9/11, and now the next thing that could happen is another one of these Muslims could end up detonating a nuclear bomb in our city.
I got you. But what Saddam's doing is not related at all to this.
No.
We're just co-opting what looks like it could be one thing and making it into something else.
Yeah, the weapons inspectors were unanimous. They had done a thorough job, and they'd reported back to the UN, and they'd reported back to our government. They were all convinced. Scott Ritter was the loudest voice, but Hans Blix at the time was saying this wasn't true. And the French were aware that this lie was going on. So there's an American congressman, he's now deceased. His name is Walter Jones, who got so exercised by the fact that the French were opposing us that he went to the cafeteria of the Congress, and I'm not making this up, and they renamed the French fries Freedom Fries there. Because, how dare the French not want to be so opposed to our security? We're going to war with Saddam Hussein. Now, I got to give Walter Jones a ton of credit because Walter Jones ended up becoming one of the most anti-war congressmen. When he found out that he had been lied to, he was embarrassed. Now, he should have been embarrassed already, but he was embarrassed and began doing everything he could to call this government to account, to get an end on the war on terror, to begin protecting civil liberties. He signed on to amicus briefs and lawsuits. He introduced legislation in the Congress. He began becoming a very, very big opponent of war and this convenience. He was very upset that he had been hoodwinked by all of this. Let's do the last ad. It's called Cost.
The question is, what'll we really win by going to war with Iraq? And what'll it cost us?
They say $100 billion.
Or more.
Countless lives lost.
Innocent women and children.
American soldiers wounded.
Dead.
But the costs of war are never paid in full on the battlefield. Only later do we discover all the hidden expenses.
Years of budget deficits.
Endless occupation duty for our troops.
More hatred directed against Americans.
More terrorist attacks.
More war.
And worst of all, once it's over, we often learn the politicians lied to us to gain our support in the first place. Years from now, will we be better off for bringing another war to the Middle East, a region that so desperately needs peace? Or will our children and grandchildren still be making payments on the second Gulf War?
Learn the true cost of another war with Iraq at truthaboutwar.com. That's truthaboutwar.com.
Those ads were professionally produced with Hollywood actors by Kristen Overn. So I'm really pleased with how they turned out. I thought we did a good job of getting our message out and speaking to people in their language.
I agree. There's something about them that reaches me, Jim. Like I've gone through that whole period now, but the ads still come back to me like in a kind of a nostalgic way that reminds me how far off base I was 20 years ago,
Well, you don't have to stay far off base. And I just, there's one point to be made about the ad that we just played, which is that the costs keep mounting.
Yeah.
So after the first Gulf War, the lies that were told, and there was more than one lie that was told that, and the embargoes and different stuff, they directly influenced Osama bin Laden. And George W. Bush took over at a time when the year before, where the budget was balanced for the first time in a long time. Now it was, balanced over in paper, and they were using Social Security funds to mix in with it. So it's not a perfect story, but the point is the deficits started after 9/11. They made a big return. This president was determined he had, just like Lyndon Johnson, so a lot of parallels between George W. Bush's policy style and Lyndon Johnson's policy style. It was very much a guns and butter policy. And he rode very high on the war. It carried him through the first term to really high rates of approval, but at the expense of a lot of things. And the social fabric begins to tear. And the seeds are being sown for a financial crisis and continuing and expanding deficits and debt that has gotten worse and worse with each passing time. The Bush administration was a disaster. It might have been one of the 2 or 3 worst administrations that we had. since Woodrow Wilson. I thought it ranked right up there at the time. George W. Bush was an awful president. It's funny because so many people there was almost been a resurrection of George W. Bush's reputation because so many people are anti-Trump, right?
Right.
It's not deserved. He should have finished his time in life out serving for war crimes in jail. I mean, he took the nation back into fiscal irresponsibility that was pretty severe. It's just a bad time in a lot of ways. He took a piece and he ended it. We ended an era that the Cold War was only over for about 10 years. He helped usher in the war on terror, which we still live with to this day, and all the surveillance state and a brand new cabinet agency. It just goes on and on. So we continue to pay the prices of this war.
Yeah, and not the least of them are personal for people who, like me, have either have been themselves in military conflict or a military veteran, the families or friends of one, or if you have a family member serving right now. And my son is serving because of 9/11. He's very clear about that. That's why he joined the Marines.
Yeah, and you've also worked with veterans who've come back from the battlefields.
Oh yeah, from post 9/11 and from Vietnam, and the cost to the United States social fabric on this is huge. It's
Contributes
just immeasurable.
contributes to the homelessness problem, and they're not adequately cared for by the Veterans Administration. The projects and services available to them are just not up to this, and these are permanently damaged human beings.
Yep. I mean, things are moving, but they're moving at the speed of the government. We finally got the VA to accept Agent Orange. Remember that from Vietnam as a factor in service, a way of being able to assess one's service-connected disabilities, they're called. We got burn pits at the same time, so everyone who was exposed to burn pits over in the desert has a way of being able to claim a service-connected disability related to that. But it doesn't change the fact that you come back injured, and
No.
not just physically, but the moral injuries that are associated with these wars or whatever we're going to call it, conflicts, continue right on up to Ukraine, where we've got guys jumping on planes to go fight against Russia in Ukraine because they know it's the right thing to do. There's remarkable patriotism here, Jim, but the cost of that patriotism is huge for us right now.
I have a problem with patriotism, and my problem is not that the people who go and do the dirty work, the fighting, are bad people. I want to be 100% clear on that. The problem is that it's part of a propaganda machine that empowers bad politicians who routinely do things that cost them nothing and only gain them. We don't gain. The people who go and fight don't gain. The people who are under all of the fighting don't gain, right? You talk to somebody who serves out in that field and they don't want to come home because their brothers are still there, right? You talk to the people who are out in the field and they begin to make friends with the civilians on the ground, and they know that those civilians help them.
Exhibit A, Afghanistan.
Yes. I've got a friend that did this in Iraq. He thinks about the people in the village that he was taking care of to this very day. And they can't continue to help them perpetually or forever. They have to come back home to their families, and the government leaves these people behind. Your politicians are very duplicitous people who've done a lot of really bad things. And then when they've gotten somebody to ally with them, they frequently turned on those people too. And yesterday's allies become tomorrow's enemies. And it becomes like an Orwell novel where it's, we were always at war with Eurasia. We were always at war with East Asia. Like it's just, it never stops. And so Saddam Hussein goes from being friend and client to being, public enemy number one.
Yeah. What's up with that?
It's well, he's not a good guy. I mean, like, how did he become our best friend in the first place? And then why did he become why in the process of him becoming public enemy number one did 500,000 people have to die under embargo conditions? And then even more under war conditions, because I think the number ended up coming out to like 2 million by the time it was done, which is a devastating amount to a country that size. And they didn't recover right away. And we were promised that they were going to be so grateful for us, they were going to pay for the liberation. In fact, they were going to share their oil rights with us. And that was a telling statement, right? And none of it came true. It's all lies. It's all lies. And to be honest with you, Bill, even the situation in Ukraine, sold a bill of goods on that too, that somehow or other, if we kept poking the bear, that was going to work out for us, right?
Right. Yeah.
That war was somehow or other going to be the solution to this whole thing. Boy, we were really going to show Putin. Well, they haven't. That war's going badly, despite the fact that the United States has been involved. And what level of involvement will the United States have to take? Does it eventually require a nuclear weapon? Like, once you start down this path, grace gets harder and harder and harder to find. Peace becomes more and more and more elusive. And if patriotism is going to be used to sell a young man or young woman into being maimed, being psychologically permanently damaged and scarred, or even dead, so that they can't live life, can't have children and grandchildren and do the things that are associated with life, if that's what the patriotism is going to be for, then I would prefer we knew the truth. And that is that politicians tend to lie, and they lie the most when it's a war. And that's what we attempted to show at truthaboutwar.org. And I would encourage people to go and check it out.